Hi there. Welcome to C3 Church Carlingford Online. My name's Sam Stewart and I'm going to be sharing with you right now in our series, Fruit That Remains. We're drawing the message in this series out of Galatians 5 and I'm going to be talking about kindness and goodness. A really interesting pair, looking at what the Holy Spirit does in our lives and the kind of fruit that it produces. This series is really embedded in and casting a spotlight on our church mission, which is to worship, reach, and build, empowered by the Spirit. If you're asking the question about who we are as a church, C3 Church Carlingford, this is one of the ways you can answer that question. We're here to worship Jesus with a passion, reach people for Jesus, build people in Jesus, and all empowered by the Holy Spirit. So this series is flowing out of Galatians 5, as I mentioned. Paul lists a very famous list of the things, the fruits that the Spirit produces in our lives when we're living by the Spirit. This preaching series is really taking the time to appreciate what the Spirit does in our lives, really taking time to appreciate what the evidence of the Spirit's activity in our lives, what it looks like. So let's jump right in. Let's have a look at the passage, the key part of the passage. And I'm going to focus right here and now on verse 22. So look at Galatians 5, verse 22. Paul says, "But the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these things." It's a very concise list. There's a lot of meaning. There's a lot of features there. We're going to unpack kindness and goodness in particular. First, a good starting point. I want us to notice a few features about this particular passage, verse 22, the list of the things that the Spirit produces in our lives, but also the whole context. First thing, notice this is a message to a community. This is Paul talking to the Galatians, a bit like a coach. The Olympics are on at the moment. The Sevens rugby, Australia, both men and women, are doing quite well. And they do it as a team. The coach speaks to them as a team. Every single person needs to be on the same playbook, following the same kinds of instructions. And it's very easy to read Paul's words in a way that isn't like that. We read it as an individual. We read it as though it's just a list of things that I have to tick off and forget the fact that Paul's talking to the Galatians as a group. And this fruit is being produced in the community of the church there. And it's something for us to notice when we read this, is to take a step back and realize that it's coming to us, you, me, everybody in the community of C3 Church Carlingford, as fruits, as things that the Spirit is going to produce in us as a community. And let's not forget that. The second thing to notice is its opposite. Paul is contrasting these fruits of the Spirit with like rotten fruits. In the passage just before, from verse 19, Paul lists out the very opposite of these fruits of the Spirit, kind of like rotten fruit. Verse 19, you can read along with me there. "When you follow the desires of your sinful nature," and this is opposite of the Spirit, "the results are very clear: sexual immorality, impurity, lustful pleasures, idolatry, sorcery, hostility, quarreling, jealousy, outbursts of anger, selfish ambition, dissension, division, envy, drunkenness, wild parties, and other sins like these. Let me tell you again, as I have before, that anyone living this sort of life will not inherit the kingdom." So that's something to notice as well. It's a contrast. This is not some abstract list of good things. This is the list that we get from verse 22, the fruits of the Spirit. It's listed in contrast to what we see in verse 19, which is the total opposite. And it helps us to see a contrast. It helps us to understand what Paul's talking about and what the Spirit's going to produce in our lives, what we're going to be looking towards, and in many instances aiming towards. And the third thing I want us to notice just at the beginning of this message is that although Jesus looms large over this particular passage, Paul is giving very specific instructions to the Galatians. We're taking these instructions on board. But the Spirit that Paul is talking about, the Spirit of God, is so perfectly demonstrated in Jesus. So perfectly demonstrated by the Master Jesus. And that's who Paul follows. That's who Paul looks to as the ultimate example. That's who Paul is calling the Galatians to follow. And that's who we're called to follow. And that's what the Spirit empowers us to ultimately do, is live a life like what Jesus exemplified. And so we need to keep that in mind, that Jesus looms large. We need to notice that Jesus is the perfect example of these things we see listed in verse 22. And in particular, today's message, Jesus is the perfect example of kindness and goodness. So those are three things to notice at the top of this message. Paul's speaking to the community. There is an opposite list that we can contrast with the list of the fruits of the Spirit. And Jesus is the perfect example of what we see, those fruits that are produced by the Holy Spirit. So focusing in on kindness and goodness, thinking about those. They're words that are common. They're words that we know. We can think of examples of kindness, like a kind lollipop lady helping people cross the road, a good person who does charity every now and then, a kind teacher, someone who is really good to their students, a really good example in the community. These are examples that can sometimes lose the profundity of what Paul is urging us towards. Sometimes kindness, like I say, if you think of a lollipop lady, it can seem a little bit weak. Sometimes goodness, it's a bit old-fashioned. It seems a bit old hat. When exploring the meanings of this and what Paul is using in this particular passage, the Bible words behind kindness and goodness have a few features that are very interesting. The kindness, the word that's used here in the Bible, similar words, words that are associated with that word, are used to describe a lack of harshness, a lack of abrasiveness. In fact, a very similar word to the word kindness here is used to describe wine in the Bible times. And that's to describe like a mellow wine, a wine that goes down really smoothly and has no abrasiveness. So that's interesting to just hang on to in our minds, is that, yes, it's kindness as we recognize it, but there's a dimension to it here that it's not harsh. Kindness has this property, when Paul talks about it, that is smooth and mellow. Now, goodness, we can think of examples of it, but one of the features of the word that's used here in the Bible, as Paul uses it here, it's a very active word. It's not just goodness that we put on, a goodness, a property that we possess, I'm a good person. Its meaning extends into, actively being good, demonstrating it. We're going to look at a passage that you're hopefully familiar with, the Good Samaritan, over in Luke 10. And I think this gives us a perfect picture of kindness and goodness as Paul is using it here in this particular passage. Follow on the reading where you can see it there. I'm going to start at verse 30 of Luke 10 and read the whole parable of the Good Samaritan. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. Verse 31. By chance, a priest came along, and when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Then a despised Samaritan man came along, And when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan man soothed his wounds with olive oil, wine, and bandaged them. He then put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn, where he took care of him. Verse 35. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." And then Jesus ends the parable asking his audience, "Now, which of these 3 would you say was a neighbor to the man who was attacked by bandits?" Jesus asked. And then the man replied, "The one who showed him mercy." Then Jesus said, "Yes, now you go and do the same." And I think this parable captures kindness and goodness really, really well. I'll go in reverse. This is the Good Samaritan. That's the parable. This is the paradigm of good, a good person. What this goodness of the Spirit is all about. And notice that the traditionally good characters in this particular story, religious leaders, temple assistants, people who have on their outside all of the signs of being extremely good people, they failed in this test. They failed in this particular parable. And the person, the Samaritan, who isn't particularly good in a biblical context, they weren't as good as the priest, they weren't as good as the temple assistant. This particular character, the Samaritan, he goes out and actively looks after the person that was attacked by bandits. There's an active component to the goodness. He's good because he actively goes out and does the thing that Jesus requires, does the thing that Jesus is holding up as the definition of goodness. To kindness, it's interesting then to notice that the Good Samaritan's kindness was to go and to tend to the injuries of the person that was injured. There was a soothing, there was a healing, there was a therapeutic dimension to the Good Samaritan's kindness. And I think that really captures some of the meaning behind the Bible words that are used in our Galatians passage. Kindness has a soothing, therapeutic antidote to harshness. And the goodness component, it's active. It's not just something that's on the outside. It actually goes out and does something. That's what makes it good. So, how can we apply this? How can we take this on and make it a lesson for ourselves? The goodness and kindness that Paul speaks of, that are the fruits of the Spirit, living a Spirit-filled life, living in community, living in opposite to what we observe in the world, and living in the pattern of the Master Jesus. And there's 3 things that I think we can take a hold of and use practically. First of all, it's to notice that kindness and goodness, they're not weak. This is not like a passive Sunday drive kind of feature of the Holy Spirit's work in our lives. That kindness is going to require you to extend yourself, to be that mellow, taking away the harshness, being that those healing hands, being the difference maker. And the goodness is active. It's not just sitting back on its heels, inactive and passive. It's a goodness that telegraphs itself to the place of need, telegraphs itself, extends itself to where it's required. The second thing that we need to realize is this is not the norm. Like what Paul describes in verses 19, all of the signs of sinful behavior, the signs that mark what he calls the world. To live in the Spirit, to see the fruits of the Spirit propagated, coming up, developing, being released in your life and in the church, that's going against the flow. That's countercultural. It's not normal. There's going to be some resistance. And then a final thing to notice, and I put here, you'll see it there, what we're describing is not possible. Now, I put that in inverted commas. Of course it's possible, but it's only made possible by the Spirit, working in our lives, working in our community, helping us to overcome and to be witnesses in the world, helping us to reach out and be the difference for people that are hurting, like in the Good Samaritan story, helping us to live counterculturally. We can only do it by the Spirit's power. I'm going to conclude by reading the passage again, and I hope you really caught something in what I'm talking about here. Kindness and goodness, they're not weak. I hope you realize that the actual application, the living demonstration in your life, requires some active participation. It requires some strength. It's going to encounter resistance. It's not the norm. It's countercultural. And the Spirit producing this in our lives, we can't do it by ourselves. We need the Spirit. Paul says to us, again, going back to the passage, Galatians 5, verse 22, but the Holy Spirit produces this kind of fruit in our lives: love, joy, peace, patience, kindness, goodness, faithfulness, gentleness, and self-control. There is no law against these things. I hope you've got something there you can take away. I hope you're encouraged to lean into the Spirit's work in your life, the Spirit's work at C3 Church Carlingford, so that you can see demonstrated all of the fruits of the Spirit, but particularly kindness and goodness. If what I'm talking about today, you responded to it in some way, it kind of touched your heart, we'd love to be able to talk or pray with you. Maybe you want to know what it means to be a follower of Jesus. Maybe this discussion about the Holy Spirit's power, the Holy Spirit's fruit in our lives, is new and you'd like to know more about it. Or perhaps you've been a follower of Jesus for some time, but you want to recommit your life to Him today. Maybe something in the message spoke to you and you'd just like some prayer. Maybe you have some needs that you want to share, and perhaps we could pray for you. If that's you, we'd love to connect with you during the week. You can scan the QR code that you can see available on your screen, or you can email prayer@c3carlingford.org.au. So use the QR code or prayer@c3carlingford.org.au. We can then stand in prayer with you. We can provide some support for you. If you've been a guest with us today and you like what you've seen so far, we'd love to hear from you. You can either email us at guest@c3carlingford.org.au or scan the QR code that you can see on the screen. Now, the QR codes, they'll take you through to a secure page where you can fill out your contact details, and one of our pastors will then connect with you during the week. We'd love to be able to answer any questions you might have, extend some prayer support, or even respond in a way that meets your needs and your questions. All right, that concludes the message. All the best.